This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian, and I'm going to do something a little bit different this episode. I've been getting a lot of questions from listeners recently, so I thought I'd feature a recent interview I did with another podcast where I talk a little more about my background and the thinking that goes into this show. That's coming up in a few minutes, but first I wanted to share some comments some of you have sent me. Listener Brad in Ontario heard my story about how social media had contributed to Angkor Wat in Cambodia getting overrun with visitors, and he said it reminded him of something that happened last year, a couple of hours from where he lives. A local sunflower farm thought it might boost their popularity a little if they let tourists come and take selfies for $7.50, he wrote. After a few days of this, they had around 7,000 cars full of people who were parking a kilometer away and crossing highways to get there. Brad sent me a link to a newspaper article where the farm's owners said some people showed up at 5:45 in the morning, and they described it as a zombie apocalypse. There were fender benders, people getting into fights, and litter left in the field. After a few days of this, they made an announcement that the farm was closed to the public for good. Brad also wrote that he enjoyed listening to me trying to throat sing, and it actually inspired him to create a Spotify playlist of Mongolian throat singing that he played in the office just to see if his coworkers would notice anything out of the ordinary. It didn't take very long, he said. He added that his 5-year-old daughter now regularly requests Mongolian throat singing on family road trips, but she knows only to ask if mommy is asleep. I just love that. Kevin, who's listening from Sicily, wrote me to say he identified with my last episode from the previous season, where I interviewed people who told me how the Mongol rally had changed their lives. I moved from small-town Indiana in 1984, and then to Italy in 1995, he said. After living in Italy for 24 years, I find I can't relate to family and old friends anymore. I'm happy I'm not the only one. Pamela messaged me to say she used to make her living performing around the world on cruise ships, and lately she's become despondent that travel is no longer a regular part of her life. She's working a corporate job that she feels is sucking her soul dry, but she's been living vicariously through my adventures, and this podcast is helping her cope with her wanderlust. Thanks for writing, Pam, and I'm thrilled I've been able to help in some small way. Hope you're able to get back to traveling soon. One listener also sent me this question.
Hi, Scott. This is Tate from Billings, Montana. I recently listened to the ayahuasca episodes and really enjoyed them, but wanted to ask, how did you make sure that when you decided to go to the ayahuasca ceremony that you were making the right decision for yourself and that the potential for sensationalism in the episode of doing an extreme thing didn't cloud your judgment and make you do something that could cause harm? And also for other podcasts that could get more views, more likes, more popularity by doing extreme things, how should people go about ensuring that they are making good judgment calls in their decisions when they're making that kind of media?
That's a really great question, Tate, and I think it's something a lot of listeners have wondered about. So let me preface my answer by sharing a secret. I sometimes describe Far From Home to people as an adventure travel podcast, but the truth is, in some ways, I'm actually not a terribly adventurous person. Now, I realize for many of you who've been listening to the show, that might sound like a strange thing for me to say, but let me explain myself. I know that over the past 36 or so episodes, I've gone to some pretty unusual places that many people would never think of going to, and I've done some sort of crazy sounding things, but none of this comes natural to me. I mean, I'm someone who's historically always traveled with a map and a plan. My instinct is to do a ton of research before I set out on a trip, so I have a pretty good idea of where I'm going and what I'm going to do each day, where I'm going to eat, who I'm going to meet, and so forth. So oftentimes when I'm doing something that seems adventurous, I'm actually forcing myself to go against my instincts. If I had to psychoanalyze myself, I think a lot of it comes down to my comfort level of wanting to feel like I'm more or less in control at all times. And certainly not to the extent that I have any desire to go on a cruise or a package tour where everything is arranged for me. But On the other hand, I've never hitchhiked and I rarely travel somewhere without a guidebook or get off a plane without already having a place to stay. Now, I've been trying to get away from some of that in recent years, but you should know that being cautious is still kind of a large part of who I am. And all this is to say that it's simply not in my nature to be reckless or do something if I feel like it's genuinely risky or dangerous, even if I do think it might get me some extra attention. So, for example, I asked a lot of questions and I made sure I knew what I was getting into before I decided to drive across Iran, visit Chernobyl, or take ayahuasca. Of course, I always experience a bit of discomfort when I do something I've never done before, especially if some other people are cautioning against it. But I think it's a matter of examining each situation on a case-by-case basis and speaking to experts, firsthand sources, and people I trust to get a good sense of what things are really like and whether any initial fears I might have are actually grounded in reality. I'll admit I struggle with ethical questions like this all the time, as I think all journalists should. I think other podcasters and reporters should constantly be asking themselves why they're making certain choices and what their real motives are. And it's incredibly subjective, so there are no easy answers. I'll just say that in my case, my motivation is never to be sensational or macho or anything like that. Instead, I think venturing outside my comfort zone just makes me a better person because it gives me more confidence about my place in the world and it helps me to become a better storyteller. You might have heard it in the tone of my voice, like when I decided to try ayahuasca. There's a certain level of emotional authenticity there that I can't help but display. I hope that's come across in my stories, and I'll try my best to continue to be open and honest with all of you about how I feel as I go about my reporting, especially when I encounter situations that are weird or uncomfortable. So, hope that answers your question, Tate, and thanks to all of you who've emailed and sent me questions. I really love hearing from listeners because making something like a podcast can be a sort of lonely activity a lot of the time. It's not like standing on a stage giving a performance where you get instant feedback from the audience. Instead, I just kind of release these episodes out into the world, and a lot of the time I don't get much of a response, and it's hard to know what people thought. So please keep the feedback coming. You could contact me through social media, or better yet, if you've got a question, ethical, aesthetic, or otherwise, that you'd like me to address, please record a voice memo on your phone like Tate did and email it to info@farfromhomepodcast.org, and I'll see if I could address it on a future show. By the way, I see people are listening to this podcast now in dozens of countries, and not just North America, Australia, Western Europe, places like that. It looks like some of you have actually downloaded recent episodes from places like Cyprus, Slovakia. I've even got a listener in Niger. If you're that person, or if you're listening somewhere interesting or doing something unusual while you listen, I'd love to hear from you. Again, the email address is info@farfromhomepodcast.org, or you could find Far From Home on Instagram or Facebook, or tweet me at Scott Gurian. Thanks. Okay, so for the rest of today's show, I'm going to feature an episode from another podcast where I was recently a guest and where I talk a bit more about my background and the thinking that goes into creating Far From Home. The program is called OPP, and it's hosted by Corey Cambridge.
God bless everybody, and welcome back to another episode of OPP. Other People's Podcast highlights America's top podcasters and the dope shows they created. I'm your host, Corey Cambridge. Our special guest this episode is award-winning radio journalist Scott Gurian, host of the amazing podcast, Far From Home, a travel show where Scott documents unexpected adventures and chance encounters with interesting people around the world. It was so much fun chatting with Scott about his career in journalism, his favorite places he's traveled around the world, and of course, we get into his dope show, Far From Home. Now, on to my exclusive interview with Scott Gurian. Yo, what up, Scott?
How are you doing?
Man, everything is everything, bro.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. Wait. So first of all, I got to shout out my homegirl, Sadie Mae. She made this connection happen. She's a humongous fan of the show.
So I gather. Yeah.
She's a diehard fan of Far From Home.
She's always posting stuff online on Instagram and everywhere, so I'm very appreciative.
Where are you from, bro?
I live in New Jersey, just outside of New York.
Okay. We're in Jersey.
I live in it's Montclair, or next to Montclair, Newark. Bloomfield's a town. So it's just like without traffic. It's like 20 minutes outside of the city. I grew up there, and then I've lived various other places in Boston and D.C. I was in Oklahoma for like 4.5 years working at a radio station, and moved back here a bunch of years ago. So I'm here for now, and hope to live abroad and do a lot more traveling in the future.
Now, your background's in radio?
Yes, I worked in public radio for a bunch of years before I got into podcasting.
Okay. Oh, man. So tell me about your career in public radio.
Wow. So how far back do you want to go is the question.
Well, I'm always interested, too, because I feel like I came and got introduced to podcasting very, very late. Like, I wasn't like a public radio fan or listener. You know what I mean? So I kind of got onto that that wave a little bit later than most folks. But how did you first fall in love with public radio or know that you wanted to get into that industry?
So way back like in high school, I was like president of the TV studio, and I was originally really interested in like TV and video. And I'm still interested to a degree, but it just so happened that kind of, interning, getting my first job and everything, I knew someone who worked in radio at a community radio station, and actually it was WBAI Pacifica here in New York. And that was kind of my foot into the door. So I just happened to know someone, started volunteering, did some reporting, just kind of learning all myself. I wasn't really trained. And then I went to school up in Boston, volunteered at a community radio station there, and then got my first job in D.C. at the age of, this would have been 2002, so I would have been like 23. And I was hired to basically at least in the beginning, single-handedly produce a daily hour-long national show.
What?
And it was ridiculous. And this was like while the Iraq War was heating up, and so we had like correspondents in Baghdad and Jordan and Syria, and so I was like keeping in touch with them, and I was like commissioning stories and editing things and booking segments and prepping the host for interviews. And sometimes I had to engineer the show live on the air. And it was like totally bonkers. Then I got a job out in just near Oklahoma City as like a news director at this public radio station. I always tell people starting out in radio, the best advice I could give is if you're willing to just go anywhere, like go to a smaller station in a smaller city, you'll be able to get your foot in the door, learn a lot quicker. You'll have a lot more freedom than if you just start in New York or Chicago or LA.
Right, major markets.
Yeah, so and I did have a ton of freedom. I was really young and would never have been hired as a news director at a station, at that age anywhere else. Got to do a little bit of everything. It was a small station, so I wasn't really directing anyone. I'd say I was like self-directed. And so I basically was the only reporter there. And some days I would put on a suit and tie and go to a press conference with the governor. And other days I would go cover a rattlesnake festival in Southwest Oklahoma. And then there was a lot of tornadoes, a lot of severe weather in Oklahoma. And I was one of the few public radio reporters in the States. I got to do a lot of national stuff for NPR whenever there was any kind of big breaking news or anything. Okay. So I got to be really well-rounded doing that. And I was there for almost 5 years. So that was really cool.
In Oklahoma?
In Oklahoma, yeah. I never imagined.
Damn.
I know. It seems totally random. But I really got to do a lot there and learn a lot.
How has working in radio helped you to become a better podcaster?
I think just having those skills coming from that background and having done this professionally for so many years, I think I have a really good ear, and I've reached the point. It's taken a number of years, but I've reached the point where I think I'm a much better editor of myself. And I listen back to some of my early stuff and I cringe, like even just my voicing and how I sound, and it just sounds really bad. I can't listen to myself. But I feel like having those years of experience gives me some knowledge of how to make something that's not just listenable, but really captivating and really, something that people enjoy listening. I know how to edit, well, so things, you don't hear all the cuts, how to mix in music, all those sorts of things. Because the thing with podcasting is the barriers to entry are so low. It's so, you could get equipment for so cheap. And there's so many people entering podcasting now. I think there's 700,000 podcasts or something like that in the iTunes store now. So there's so many people who are like, oh, I should start a podcast. And a lot of it is just like people talking with their friends in an echoey room in their garage or something. And I think having that background where I've worked in radio and I kind of know how to produce something, how to craft a story and how to make it sound good just from a technical standpoint, I think really helps me a lot.
Your role in radio, was it more focused on producing stories and working behind the scenes, or was it auditory as well?
No, it was mostly like doing stories, reporting.
Okay.
And when I was in Oklahoma, I was sometimes on the air, like live, like hosting the news, reading the weather and the traffic, and whatever 4 times an hour, filing stuff for the newscast for NPR, for and doing actual stories out in the field. So yeah, most of what I did, I did some producing stuff behind the scenes as well, but most of it was like in front of the mic and actually producing stories, editing. Yeah.
Okay. What are your top 3 favorite places that you've been, and why?
Oh, wow. That's so hard to choose. I really liked Ecuador. I think that was one of my favorite trips I've taken. And unfortunately, that was before I was recording audio, so I don't have any radio stories from there. I'll have to go back. But I went there with my brother one year, and we just did so much, from, going to the rainforest, to the edge of the Amazon, to going to the Galapagos Islands, which is really cool. And then, in Quito. And we just crammed in a lot in a short amount of time, but not a whirlwind. Like, I feel like we really got to see it, and there was just so much variety. And then we were there for New Year's Eve, where people basically were lighting their own fireworks in the intersections, and they make these giant effigies, like almost like scarecrows. And they set them in these huge bonfires and just all the middle of the street intersections, and they're burning them at midnight to kind of as a symbol of like burning their fears and worries from the past year. And that was just incredible. That was a really cool experience. I really like Thailand.
Okay.
I'm a big foodie, so that's a big part of it. I don't eat meat. I eat fish and, vegetables, and the food in Thailand is really good, and a lot of it's vegetarian and super cheap. And it's a cool country too. Bangkok, I really enjoyed. So I'd like to go back and spend some more time there. But of course, I have a big, long bucket list of other places I'd like to see as well. And where else? As far as my favorite places, there's a lot of more Western cities I really like. Berlin, Amsterdam was cool, even though it's pretty expensive.
Okay.
But yeah, I have such a big, long list of places I have yet to go. And I feel like my favorite list is always, what's my favorite city? Maybe the last place I've been. There've definitely been places I haven't been so into, like Phnom Penh, Cambodia. It just didn't seem that interesting. There's not that much to see. It's not really a tourist city, and it's, it's such a big world, and there's so much to see.
Okay. All right. So Scott, how did you first discover the medium of podcasting?
Oh, wow. I was listening to podcasts really early. But originally it was just, radio shows that started just releasing their shows or segments of their shows on the internet. And you would have to download them and then connect an iPod or something, or a phone, or this is even before phones could play audio files. You'd have to connect something to your computer and then transfer the files over. It was, I make myself sound old. And yeah, this was before iPhones, and then iPhones came along, and now it's so easy. You don't even need to download things. You could just stream them. So yeah, I was listening from the very beginning pretty much. There were some really cool shows at the beginning that I really liked that unfortunately are no longer around.
What were some of those shows?
Well, the one that comes to mind was something. I think it was a series that, again, this was a radio series, a short little series of stories, but I guess they made it as a podcast as well. It was from KCRW, a radio station out in California, and it was called The Final Curtain. And I don't remember. I just caught it at the very end, so I'm sorry I had missed the whole thing. But it was a radio obituary program, and each episode they would do like obituaries of people who had died like the previous week or whatever, of really interesting people who, like, kind of like your show Silent Giants, where it's like people behind the scenes who you might not recognize their name, but they did really interesting things in their lives, and or they played some small role in history or something, and it was really fascinating to hear the stories about their lives. So that was really cool. I really liked that.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I started listening right at the very end, and then like a few episodes in, okay, it's over now. So that was a shame. But But I'm such a podcast listener now. It's like hard to remember the time before podcasts.
Did you know from listening to the medium and discovering podcasts that you'd one day want to start one yourself?
I don't think I considered it that early on. No. I mean, I was so kind of in the radio world, and this is before anyone could like make a living making a podcast. And, and again, early on, podcasts weren't really their own thing. It was like radio shows that were just releasing their segments as podcasts.
Okay.
Or for people who, like, again, I was listening to this show from California, but I was here in New York. And, for listeners outside of their area who couldn't listen over the air, they would listen on the internet or as, in one of those like early podcasts. So that's what, I originally thought the medium was. And but now it's evolved so much where podcasts are kind of their own thing, and there's so many people I have so many friends who don't even work in public radio anymore. They've left that world, and they're now just in the world of podcasts. And I feel bad saying this, having worked in public radio for so many years, but I hardly listen to the radio anymore.
Yeah, I mean. It's not even a public radio thing. It's more like a technology thing. Like the technology,
everything's on demand now.
It's on demand now, right?
Netflix exactly. started it, and now it's like dictated everything else. Like people just want to listen to what they want to listen to when they want to listen to it.
For folks listening, give me the elevator pitch of Far From Home.
So people often say that it's a small world, and that's true to a certain degree, but the world. It's really, there's so many parts of the world that people never think about and they never go to. And there's, billions of people and literally billions of stories that we never hear. And so I try to, on my podcast, Far From Home, travel to some of those places and tell some of those stories. I think it's a show kind of partially about my kind of unexpected adventures and chance encounters with interesting people around the world. And it's part journalism because that's my background, but part, kind of narrative first person storytelling. But I don't want to make it all about me either. It's more about the people I meet and the experiences I have. But, trying to look for opportunities to kind of go a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but then to really dive into local cultures and find things that are not typical touristy. It's kind of a travel show, but it also sort of isn't. Like I kind of am not looking for typical tourist kinds of things. I'm looking to go kind of off the beaten path, to go to places that typical tourists wouldn't go, to find stories that they wouldn't find. And I'm trying to really make an effort to do not kind of helicopter journalism where I just like show up at a place and then I'm gone right away. Like I try to kind of spend more time to like spend a few weeks in a place to really get to know it and to really get to know the people and the culture. To find things that I wouldn't otherwise find.
So tell me about the inception of Far From Home. Where did the idea come from, and how did you get inspired to start that podcast?
Well, so I had, I've always loved traveling, and like even when I was working in radio, I think the coolest experiences I ever had when I was reporting was when I was abroad in a different culture, in a different place. So my brother and I, a few years ago, started traveling like every year over like Christmas and New Year's. We would take some big trip. We didn't have a lot of close family left in the area. And we figured over the holidays, like, what are we going to do? Just, cook dinner and sit home by ourselves. We might as well go somewhere interesting. And so we started like this tradition of taking a big trip every year over the holidays. And we went to Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands one year. We went to Thailand and Cambodia. And then this one year we were in Cuba, and we were in like a tour group there. We don't usually do tours, but Cuba, it seemed like just logistics of getting around or whatever. We thought it would be easier. So we were in this tour group, and we kind of had some issues in our tour, and our tour guide kind of got drunk and abandoned our group one evening. Oh. And so all of us in the tour group kind of bonded. And there was this one woman in the group, her name was Rosie. She's a Brit, but she now lives in Western Australia with her husband, Alan. She and Alan were in the tour group. We kept in touch with her on Facebook. She messaged us a number of months later and said, "Hey, I'm planning this crazy trip with my best friend, Jane. We're going to take part in this charity event. We're going to be driving in a little tiny car from the UK all the way to Mongolia, 11,000 miles. It's part of this group called the Mongol Rally, raising money for charity. And would you and your brother be interested in joining us?" Wow. And yeah, I was like, that sounds amazing. Like I knew she was doing it, but I until she actually asked us, like the idea wasn't planted in my mind, like, oh, you could do this with her. Like, and when she said that, I was like, whoa, this sounds really cool.
Hell yeah, sign me up.
And then it was pretty soon after I decided to go, I was like, well, wait, I should make a podcast about this. So I did a whole season of episodes about this trip, and, just the planning the route, getting the visas and the vaccinations. I did a whole episode about what kind of car do you buy for a trip like that. Just all the little elements of it, and then documenting the journey itself through 18 countries that we went along the way, all across Southeast through Europe, and then across just all the complications geopolitical events that are totally beyond our control, no matter how much planning we did. Where this is back in the summer of 2016, where we ended up at the border to enter Turkey 6 days after the attempted coup. We're like, what do we do? We're like, what the hell? Like, we're scrambling at the last minute. Like, can we still go that way? Do our visas allow us to go a different way? Is it safe? Do we modify our route?
One thing that really impressed me about the show and listening is that you took me on an experience where it was a physical experience for you, a visual experience for you, and you put it into audio form to make me feel like I was there with you.
Yeah.
What is the process for you creatively to give the listener that experience, to feel like they're with you on this trip?
Well, as the reporter, as the person with the microphone, I'm the eyes for the listener. People sometimes say, like, if you ask people in the radio or podcast world who've been doing it a while, there's this phrase that radio is a visual medium, or podcasting is a visual medium, which sounds weird, but it really is. Like, if you're capturing good sound and describing the details of a situation in a way that people could really picture it, in some ways it's way more intimate than video is, where someone's just sitting and watching and you're kind of showing them exactly what something looks like. But when you're just describing it and they just hear the sounds, they form these images in their mind. And so it's images that are very personal to them. And yeah, they might not be exactly accurate to what the situation's like, but it's their own images. And so it's very intimate and very personal. And that's what I really try to do, to get good sound and to really give people that sense that they're in a place to, I sometimes call it the podcast for armchair adventurists, to really make people feel like they're in that place. There's a lot of like travel podcasts out there, but most of them that I've heard are just like people, even if they're like in Bangkok or wherever they are, they're like sitting in their hotel room at the end of the day talking about what they did that day and what they saw and where they went. And yeah, I guess there's an audience for that, and that's okay. But I feel like that's not using audio to its full potential. I want to hear the sounds of those places. I want to hear the sounds of the street and the accents and the cars honking and the birds and the trees and the rainforest, whatever. That's really the power of audio, I think. And so I try to kind of use that to its full potential.
Before we get into our podcasters picks, from Far From Home, what do you want the listener, what's the underlying message that you want the listener to walk away with about your show?
So I'm just trying to introduce people to other cultures and other people around the world, just to let them know that the world isn't necessarily a big, scary place. Even on our big trip we took, as I mentioned, like some people, especially like our father, my brother's girlfriend, they were really concerned about us going to like Iran as an American and saying, are you going to be safe? And people are going to be chanting death to America. And a lot of times the images we have from, thousands of miles away are totally not, maybe there's an element of realities to them, but a lot of times they're also very disconnected. And actually being there on the ground was totally different than anyone told me about. It was the friendliest people I've ever met in all my travels in Iran. Who would have guessed? It's just the sense of Persian hospitality where you meet total strangers, and after chatting with them for 5-10 minutes, they're inviting you to come to their home, come for tea, come for dinner, come stay with them. They were so excited to meet us as Americans. They had so many questions. They wanted to practice their English. In Cuba as well, the history of relations between Cuba and the U.S., people there were very friendly as well. They loved American baseball. They were so excited to see us, So I think that's the main message I'm trying to get across, that wherever you go in the world, most people are just good people, and they're friendly. They're willing to help you out if you get lost or stranded, and that the world is not as bad as people think it is. At least I'm an eternal optimist, but my experiences have borne that out. And just to give people an insight to some of these places which they might not know about or might be afraid of, to let them know that there's people there just like you and me.
Wow. So, Scott, we've come to a point in the show called our Podcasters Picks. And this is when I ask the guests of today's show to give me their top 3 favorite podcasts that we should be listening to and describe them to the audience.
So people, obviously, they know about the big This American Life, Radiolab, all those. So I was trying to pick some more obscure things. I really like Reply All also, but I assume people probably know that. The 3 I would say would be Scott Carrier. Home of the Brave.
Okay.
He's worked in public radio for a number of years. He's had a bunch of segments on This American Life. And he has this knack for striking up conversations with total strangers and just getting really interesting things. Like the first story he ever did for public radio, he like lived in Utah and he just hitchhiked across the country and to NPR's headquarters in DC, showed up with a bunch of tape and said, "Hey, do you want to make a story out of this?" And just the stories he was able to get from total strangers along the way. Like I'm jealous of that. Like I aspire to do that. And it's just really amazing. And he does that. And he did radio for a bunch of years. And now he has his podcast, Home of the Brave. And he's been going to places like he just went to like the Strait of Hormuz to like, if the U.S., if we're going to start a war with Iran, like I want to get to know that place and the people. He went to Honduras a while back, just, because you hear about all the refugees coming from there. And like, well, he wanted to see, well, what's it actually like there? And he met these gang members and like just hearing the stories of these people and just, and he goes to these places, you're like, wow. And just meeting these total strangers and telling these amazing stories. So I really like Scott Carrier, Home of the Brave. I also really like Embedded from NPR, Kelly McEvers, who's a host on All Things Considered. Actually, because I don't listen to the radio anymore. I don't know if I think she is still an ATC host, but she has this podcast called Embedded where the idea behind it is, she used to be a foreign correspondent in like Baghdad and other places as well. And to do this kind of storytelling where you're like embedded in a place, but domestic as well, to really be able to tell a story well, to not just parachute in, but to like spend time in a place. And I try to do that as well, to really be in a single place for a while, to really gain people's trust, to like learn the stories and the culture, to reach, every journalist aspires to like reach that point where maybe people are nervous when you first show up with a microphone, but you're there long enough that you kind of become a fly on the wall. Yeah. And you get these stories out of people that you wouldn't otherwise, and they become really comfortable with you and they almost forget that you have a microphone. So I really like Embedded. And then this show, which actually is unfortunately not around anymore, but people could go back and check out the whole archives. It was called State of the Reunion, and it was hosted by Al Letson, who's now the host of Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. And what they would do, it was like a radio show, but they made it a podcast as well. And each show, they would go to a different city around the United States. And they would spend the whole show like in that city, like finding the local stories and the local people. And his motto was like, at the end of the show, he'd always say, remember, when things fall apart, it's up to all of us to, bring things back together. To kind of tell stories of cities and neighborhoods, like overcoming adversity and persevering. And, when places, when there were challenges in places like Laramie, Wyoming, after Matthew Shepard was killed, or different cities that were kind of down on their luck, where, people came together and got past those challenges. And so I feel like there's an element of that in what I do as well in some of my shows, where I'm kind of profiling places and kind of not telling kind of a Pollyanna-ish story of like, oh, isn't this place great? But to really kind of get beyond just the stereotypes that people might have about a certain place or about the people who live there, to really get to know the people and, tell the story of how this place or this culture might not be the way you expect. But it's actually, there's a lot more positive about it than you might think.
And Scott, why do you podcast?
Part of it is the selfish part. Just, getting to, again, being a journalist and having this microphone to get to go on these crazy adventures and meet these people and tell these stories. But I'm also just genuinely, I think, curious about the world. And I just love experiencing different cultures and understanding how things work in different places and trying the local foods and understanding the customs. And I just find it immensely fascinating. And to not just have those experiences for myself, but to share them with other people. Because I think a lot of other people are curious about those things as well. And then also, as I said, also to kind of change people's perceptions and tell them stories about places that they might not have heard, and to, change this idea that this place is scary, or all these people in place X are, this certain way, to kind of tell them that, things aren't necessarily that way, that, here's this other interesting angle or this interesting story you might never have heard about. And you might think this about these people or about this place, but it's not necessarily that way. It could be totally different.
Well, my G, Scott, it's such a pleasure having you on the show, man. Far From Home is a dope pod.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Sadie Mae for referring me to Far From Home and having Scott here on the show today. I really appreciate you, man.
I'm so glad you had me on. Thank you so much. You do a great show as well.
My God, God bless you.
Thanks.
We out.
That was Corey Cambridge interviewing me on his show OPP, Other People's Podcast. You could check it out on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It was mixed by Joshua Coleman with music by Richie Quake. You might also like Corey's other show called Silent Giants, where he highlights superstars behind the scenes of popular culture whose names you might not know, but you certainly recognize their work. People like Michael Jackson and Madonna's choreographer, the guy who made the New York Knicks logo, and the architect who designed Studio 54. Again, the program is called Silent Giants, and you can look for it wherever good podcasts are found. As for me, I want to thank the Public Radio Exchange, as always, for podcast hosting and technical support. Far From Home's logo comes courtesy of Polemic, which designs award-winning experiences all over the world at the intersection of culture, commerce, and community. Find out how they could help your business at polemicdesign.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.